Lisa, will you just give me the signal when you're ready to start?
Certainly.
Lisa, will you just give me the signal when you're ready to start?
We're ready, Rowena.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel to the Asian American, so complexity of Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander identities. Kiana, I did change that. And it's a conversation on the complexity of our identities. So welcome, and we are recording this session just so everyone is aware. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to center us and acknowledge that while we are convened virtually, we are still physically somewhere, and the land which we occupy matters. The history of the land, its gifts, its original inhabitants and stewards matter. I am currently on the invaded and ceded land of the Spokane tribe and the connected tribes of this region, who in all their beauty, love, and strength continue to resist oppression and colonization. Too often, as people, we participate in anti-indigeneity and indigenous erasure in our disconnection from the history of the places we occupy and the ongoing plight of our indigenous siblings in their struggle for honored sovereignty, access to their land lifeways, and too often, their basic humanity. While Indigenous folks are the victims of America's first sin, let us be reminded of the power and resiliency of Indigenous people around the world as we reflect on our shared ancestral roots, power, and solidarity. Let us all participate in our own and collective decolonization in order to remember and embrace our own Indigenous roots. And let us continue to take real action in support of Indigenous elders and leaders in their efforts for land back, removal of harmful mascots and imagery, and the protection of our planet's biodiversity. Please join me in taking a moment to acknowledge this together. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm grateful to our panelists for taking part in this complex and timely conversation about Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander identities. I'm Rowena Pineda, current co-chair of the Spokane chapter of the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition, or APIC. I'm 1.5 generation Filipino who grew up in the Bay Area and moved to Spokane in 2005. In a minute, we will have an opportunity to learn more about each of our panelists. I would like to thank Eastern Washington University for hosting the space for this panel discussion. Many thanks to Eastern's AAPI Month Planning Committee and the sponsors of this month. The full list can be found on the Eastern AAPI Month website. Please also check out the schedule for the remaining events, including the screening of Minari and Kapayamahu on May 21st. Just want to review a couple of logistics with us. For questions that you have later on, questions on chat will be monitored by a team from Eastern led by Lisa Logan with the Women and Gender Education Center. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time that we may not be able to get to all of your questions, given that we only have 90 minutes. And we do have a total of 90 minutes, which I know will go quickly. So please know that not everyone on the panel will be able to answer each of the questions that we will be talking about today. I also just want to review a couple of guiding principles with all of us. The first one is be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We are going to be having some complex discussions today, and it's not necessarily going to be comfortable. So let's sit with that discomfort. And also just to expect and accept non-closure. This is a beginning conversation and an ongoing conversation. We're not going to solve anything tonight. I want to introduce our panelists. We are used to our identities being defined in binary terms. Our panelists honor the multiple dimensions of our identities and celebrate each individual's and our community's complexities. With that, each panelist will have 2 minutes to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who they are. I'm going to start with Kiana McKenna.
Ooh, I get to go first. Thanks, Rowena. Hi, everyone. My name is Kiana McKenna. Pronouns are she, her. Thanks for listening in today. I am from Spokane, Washington, and I'm in Spokane right now. I'm actually part of APIC, so I get to work with Rowena and some of the folks on this, some of the other panelists on this call. I grew up, born and raised in Spokane, Washington, pretty much. My dad's from South Korea. My mom's from Spokane. I have Samoan, Korean, Chinese, and white heritage. And grew up here with my 3 siblings. Both my parents are here, come from a really big family. Parents are both one of 11. So I have a big extended family in Spokane. I went to Gonzaga University where I got my degree in public relations and actually got into community work pretty much right after graduation. I currently work at Group Health Foundation in community engagement and I guess not during the day and every other moment in between. I work at the Pacific Islander Community Association and do community organizing here in Spokane and in Eastern Washington and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Let's see what else. I live on the South Hill with my dog and my partner, and I am so happy it's spring. Thanks, Rowena.
Great. Thank you, Kiana. Now we go to Ryan Louie.
Thank you, Rowena. Hey, everyone. My name is Ryan Louie, and my ethnicity and my gender appear to be ambiguous. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and have black hair that's pulled up into a bun. I'm wearing a blue floral polo shirt and a gray jacket. And this is just a quick appearance test of guess who Ryan is? And I'm sure you want to know more. And there have been many times in my life where people have played that game, whether it was intentional or unintentional. It was, guess what Ryan is? People have thought that I was Japanese or Korean. And when I get my tan on, they think I'm Mexican or Hawaiian, Filipino. But no one ever really guesses that I'm Chinese. I grew up in Redondo Beach, California. I played in sports leagues where I was one of many Asian and Pacific Islanders. I was one of the tallest in those leagues, but I also played in sports leagues where I was the shortest and an ethnic minority. And up until high school, I played on both girls and boys sports teams. And in another instance of guess who Ryan is, it was what gender am I? And as diverse as LA was in the 90s and 2000s, I just had a really hard time finding friends or family or even media of like who I could really be. Back then, people called me a tomboy. They called me a boy. I was known as a girl and also as Brandon's sister, who is actually a boy. And all those names just never, they don't sit with me. They still don't. And what really hurt the most was that I didn't know what to call myself. So I settled and just tried to align with my gender that I was assigned at birth. But when I was 26 and living in Boulder, Colorado, I met my friend Sylvan. And they were one of the first non-binary people I've ever met. And they saved my life. And so thank you all for meeting me, and I'll send it off back to Rowena.
Thank you, Ryan. And now we'll go with Sam.
Hi, my name is Sam Lee. My Korean name is Lee Jong-ah. I was also born and raised in Spokane, Washington. I'm still in Spokane, Washington. This is my first year at Eastern. My mom is Korean. My biological father, who is white, was white, and he's no longer in my life. My stepfather is Korean. Both my parents, my stepfather and mom, were born in Korea, in South Korea, and so my stepsister is also Korean. I didn't know my dad was half white until last year. And so I've always felt like I've been in a very Korean family, traditional Korean household, and it wasn't until my early 20s I started exploring my identity, my racial identity, and otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. Now we'll go to Sarah.
Thanks, Rowena. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarahdixit. My pronouns are she, her. And by day, I'm the senior field organizer for Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho out here in Spokane, and newly going to be an incoming co-chair for the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition in town alongside Ryan. So super excited to start doing that very, very soon. I am the daughter of Gujarati Indian immigrants and a proud Southern Californian, Pasadena to be specific. I also come from a large family. If you think about it in like a nuclear standpoint, I only have 2 siblings, but in our family, we consider all our cousins to be our siblings as well. And one of my cousins is listening in today. So we are very close, and I love coming from a large family. I moved up to Spokane in 2014 to go to college at Whitworth University, where I majored in sociology and developed my passion for social justice, and have made the city my new home. Although being a first generation Indian American has its challenges for sure, I wouldn't want it any other way because it has made me into the person I am today.
Thank you, Sarah. And now we go to Tamika.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Tamika Williams. I was actually not born in the States. I was born on Guam, Tamuning, Guam in 1984. I was born and raised there until I was 12. My mom is Chamorro and Filipina, and my dad is Black. And so he was in the military, and we moved when I was 12 to California, where we lived for a couple years until my dad retired up in Spokane, Washington, near my mom's, well, one of my maternal cousins. My family is largely like Sarah's, in which our cousins are like our siblings. So I have come from a big extended family as well. Coming to the States for me was definitely like a culture shock. And it's still a culture shock. Being mixed does have a big impact on my identity, especially considerably being Black mixed, as well as Pacific Islander, where Indigenous communities can also have sometimes anti-Blackness. So dealing with anti-Blackness is a thing that kind of measures every part of my life. But yeah, other than that, I'm an artist, I'm a writer, I'm a designer. I've essentially done it all if it has anything to do with stories. I've written comics, I've done comics. I'm a 3D artist, a 2D artist, and I'm currently writing an Indigenous young adult fantasy novel. And that's me in a nutshell.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamika. Thank you, everyone. And thanks again for being here tonight. So just a reminder, we have 4 questions that I'm going to ask first, and that because of the limited time that we have, not every panelist will be answering each question. So for the first question we have is, May is designated as Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I want to start by dissecting the label of Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, or NHPIs. These terms encompass a diversity of cultures and heritages, each with distinct histories. So the question is, the term still relevant? How do we acknowledge that within this inclusive, quote unquote, inclusive term, there are communities that are erased? At the same time, how do we build unity? So for this question, I'm going to ask Kiana and Tamika to address it, and I'll start with Kiana.
Thanks, Rowena. And I appreciate the space for this conversation today. API in the Asian American Pacific Islander grouping was never relevant. It was convenient, and with a lack of knowing for our federal government to group Asians Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders all into one group. I happen to be a true API, if you will, being both Asian and Pacific Islander. But this, I was not the kind of person that our federal government was thinking about when they did this grouping. And more than not, there are Asians and Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders that are not multiracial, or they are, but they're not necessarily one or the other. So I have and continue to see, and I think all of our communities do, we see this aggregation across the board. And for the sake of this panel and for my communities, the issue with the Asian and Pacific Islander grouping is that for decades, NHPI have been invisibilized. And in addition to being missing targeted funding that goes towards multiracial organizing, Asian API organizing, if you will, it completely misses NHPI communities and other efforts to improve health outcomes among NHPI. We also see issues in data. In Washington State, for example, this last year, Washington State is actually one of less than 20 states in the US that disaggregates COVID-19 data. And in this last year, what we've learned is that NHPI communities have actually had the highest death and hospitalization rates out of any other community. And so if it weren't for the disaggregation, we would have never known what was wholly happening to our family members. And we never would have been able to get the support and the funding that we needed at many different levels to actually respond to this crisis and heal in our community. You can't really get detailed data or any detailed information from aggregated data. And without accurate data, you cannot actually address the issues and are most vulnerable. And so this happens both in our NHPI communities as well as Asian communities. And how are we to address our most vulnerable if we don't even know how they need help or what they need help with? And so moving forward, we build unity, I think, through better allyship. It's true that in this grouping, our Asian and NHPI communities have built allyship and organized together for a long, long time. However, I think it's important that we recognize the way that we've been working has not been equally for all people under this grouping, and therefore we must support Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in their movement for disaggregation of their community data, their funding, et cetera. And as Asians and NHPI, I think we need to hold hands and create visibility where there has been none or too little. And the last piece that I'd offer is that one effort we've been taking in the community and at a grassroots level with community partners and other community organizations is asking folks to even change their language. And this is a challenge, but we ask folks to actually stop saying API or AAPI. And we understand that it's built into institutions, multiracial organizations, and so many other things, but we better see where the issues are if we start saying what we actually mean. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders. So I'm just saying, let us all be seen and let's keep holding hands in doing so.
Great. Thank you, Kiana. Tamika.
So, and I want to give everybody a heads up about the uncomfortability. I tend to get really bent out of shape with this type of topic. I get angry, but I think it's important for some of y'all to sit with that anger, because that is kind of that's an important part of this. I am very angry about this. Now, regarding the very specific AAPI thing, yeah, it's actually funny because I went into Barnes and Nobles yesterday and I saw their AAPI display. It was all Asian. The entire thing was Asian. And I mentioned it even to one of the workers there, respectfully, because I work at Walmart and I understand customers relationships and all that stuff. And they appreciate that I brought it up to them, but it just kind of shows to a bigger issue. It's not AAPI Myth, it's AA Month. Because y'all, and I'm going to say y'all mostly to the audience, y'all don't really understand, don't really know anything about Pacific Islanders. You don't know what we exist. I'm Chamorro. I guarantee out of everybody here, most people don't even know what that is. You all know, everybody knows what Hawaiian is, largely because when it comes to PI relations too, Polynesians are very largely overrepresented versus us Micronesians. And even those terms in and of themselves are already slightly problematic, just for us to dissect. But I agree with Kiana. I don't think it's relevant at all. I don't think it's ever relevant. And people forget, like, I'm from Guam. So we have been the target of occupation for like 400 years. People have been coming to our island for a very long time because we're in a strategic spot in the Pacific. We're a nice little fueling point. And I think everybody forgets that in World War II, the Japanese invaded us. I think everybody forgets that um, Asia has not largely been very kind to us, and every other, and granted, this is more complicated. Every other year, North Korea threatens to bomb us to this day, and I just think that we're not the same. People think that we're the same because we happen to live near the ocean. We don't. And I want to say something too is that like this label is for white people. Everything that has to do with America that puts all minorities together, you guys can be Irish, German, whatever. It's for white people. It's to make y'all feel better. It's to make it comfortable for you guys because white people in general don't really understand our side of complexities. They can be complex all they want, but people don't even realize that all Asians don't agree with each other. In fact, a lot of Asian countries don't even like each other. Like China and Japan, that's a very taut and very fraught relationships. Like Pacific Islanders do not all even, we disagree a lot. And so you can imagine how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we come from cultures that we disagree a lot. We don't agree with, but I stand by, I die on this hill that this label is not for Pacific Islanders. It's not for Asian Americans. It's not for brown people. This label is for white people. It's to make white people feel comfortable. It's the same thing they did with Native Americans, which First Nations and Native American people, we have more in common with them, really. But it's not for us. It's for y'all. It's to make us palatable. And we are not people to be palatable. We're human beings. And so I think that people have to like sit with that it's like so much that's built around minority relations, especially in academia, is not for us. It is for to be palatable to capitalism, to white people, to colonizers, to make everybody here more comfortable, to forget the fact that you invaded our lands, you took our lands, and then as a black person, you took us from our lands, and now we are the scorn of pretty much everybody else. So for me, there's a lot of pain there of knowing that every part of my existence comes from color, was touched. I shouldn't largely not even exist. Like I'm almost a taboo existence in a certain fashion. So the AAPI terminology is a bit of a spit and slap in my face. I've never really thought about it even until this year, until I had to delve into my own personal stuff. So my plea is a little bit more emotional and more angry, but it really like nobody thinks about how everything is made for y'all, for white people, and it really shouldn't be because you are guests here in a way, annexed to most of the world, and that anger is just insurmountable that I have, and just like a lot of Native Hawaiian and PI people, but we don't get to express it because y'all don't really know anything about us. So yeah, I don't think AAPI is relevant really at all. Really, PI people should even get their own month in a way. Give us the summer. We like the summer.
Tamika, thank you for that. I really appreciate the anger um, and the discomfort that is created by those comments. And what Kiana also said, we need to sit with that because, as you said, these are terms that are created for us to label us. So appreciate you both for your comments. I'm going to move to question number 2. And I do see that we have questions coming in. So hopefully more questions will come in from the audience. So question number 2, Asian Americans have long been viewed as the model minority. How has this term caused harm to us individually and as a group? And then within the broad Asian American and NHPI communities, who has benefited and who has been harmed? How has the model minority myth caused harm? And then how has the model minority myth caused harm to other BIPOC communities? And with this one, I'm going to ask Sarah, Sam, and Kiana to respond. And I'm going to start with Sarah.
Thanks, Rowena. Yeah, so for going first, I'm going to try to do kind of some background information and also kind of dive into some of those questions. So obviously this is a big question and there's a lot that can and should be said about this issue. To start off, I want to define the term for folks who might not be familiar with it. So essentially, the model minority myth says that Asians, in truly the broadest sense of the word, because it typically is used just for that label, are smart, polite, successful, law-abiding, hardworking, socioeconomically thriving model citizens, and are shining examples of overcoming racism and discrimination to live the American dream. So now, after having a rough definition of that, it is extremely important to call out how this model minority myth was created to pit Asian Americans and NHPI communities against our Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, to remove solidarity from our vocabulary and to shove us into a scarcity mindset where we must play by the rules of white supremacy and capitalism to survive. Where we compete with one another for a slice of that so-called American dream. It is a stereotype that creates a monolithic narrative that leaves no room for the full range of diasporic and diverse experiences and erases the racism and historical discrimination against our people. They even wrote this requirement of being model minorities into the 1965 National Immigration Act, where they would allow immigrants to come to the US if they had desirable job skills, which was determined, of course, by folks in the US, which is how my father was able to come to the United States, knowing the requirement and picking a job and career accordingly. It is a tactic, so white people try to use our community's perceived success to place a racial wedge so that they can minimize the role that racism plays, its history, and its impact on so many communities of color. More and more people are finally realizing that this concept of being a model minority is a trap, but unfortunately, this realization has come at the hands of brutal violence due to the pandemic. However, we've always known that no matter how much we try to assimilate to whiteness, we will always be seen as other and ask the question, but where are you really from? Because we aren't white. And we are finally having a more widespread conversation of how aligning ourselves with whiteness at the expense of other BIPOC communities will not save us from the outcomes of racism. Personally, I didn't have the language to talk about the pressures of being a model minority until I was older. But looking back, I see it in a lot of places in my life. There's this common expectation within Indian families that you have to be a doctor, an engineer, or some other high status career to succeed in the US. And that pressure to live up to that was always so difficult for me. In my nuclear family, my siblings are extremely intelligent, and being 14 and 10 years older than me, yes, I always had them at the forefront of my mind of what it looked like to be a successful Indian American. I tried so hard to fit myself into this very specific type of box, my actual skills and passions be damned. And it wasn't until I'd moved away from home and gained some perspective that I started to entertain ideas of what my life could actually look like. And living into this model minority myth has definitely impacted my mental health, which is a whole different conversation, which we can deal with later. And it's something I'm still working on to rewire my brain.
Thank you, Sarah. Sam?
Thanks, Sarah, for that context. I appreciate it. Yeah, I agree the model minority was born from white supremacy, and like you said, Sarah, it functions as a wedge. My family in particular upholds the model minority, and I think that they expect or hope for status, wealth, power, or that it'll become more accessible to them. And it's just not the case. It's not going to happen. And on an individual, personally, when I was younger and on, I felt pressure to live up to the model minority. And my parents also, they wanted me to be a great piano player. They wanted a doctor. They wanted a movie star because of white supremacy, because I'm mixed white. And it was a lot. And subconsciously or consciously, teachers assumed that I didn't need any help because of the model minority. And I felt too ashamed to say that I needed help. And so I just never got any of the support that I needed to get through school. As an adult, I understand how I was upholding the model minority now, and I think it's important for people, for Asians and Asian Americans to think about how they continue to uphold it. It's very harmful and oppressive to uphold the model minority for other Asian Americans and HPI communities. Upholding the model minority means that we're ignoring the wealth disparity within our own communities, and it contributes to our erasure, while also enacting violence on Black people who are told that despite American apartheid, slavery, police brutality, etc., and the vastly different histories of Asian Americans and Black people, that their oppression is actually because of individual failures on their part. That is what white supremacy reiterates, and that is, of course, not true in the slightest.
Thank you, Sam. Kiana?
Thanks, Rowena. And Sam and Sarah have answered really beautifully already. And I'll just, I'll start by adding that in clarity. And since we are being careful about how we talk about this, a lot of the harm that has come at the hands, if you will, of the model minority myth has been towards Asians and Asian Americans, not NHPI. And so I will start by saying that. And ways that I have felt the model minority myth oftentimes, and especially in my adult life as I've started organizing, is through erasure. I hear community leaders or other political figureheads talking about the harms of systemic racism, policy issues that are negatively impacting our communities, and they completely leave out Asians. And they might start by saying Black, Latinx, Native American, and they stop there. And, there's an issue of Pacific Islanders never even being included, but they always stop and they never say Asians. And there are certain issues even that aren't thought to be an issue in Asian American and Asian communities. One of those being immigration, for example. And so if you break down the model minority myth, and this was really interesting when I learned about this, but you have the model being superhuman. So our doctors, our lawyers, scientists, a pianist, like Sam said, and then you have the minority part, which alludes to something that's like subhuman or less than human. And the issue, and an example of this is like disease carrier, right? And so with the model minority myth, our community members are never quite human. And because Asians, through the model minority myth, have been used as a standard, it's also harmed and perpetuated stereotypes and other harmful narratives in other BIPOC communities. And I think Sam put this really, really great. In turn, also, I think something that's not talked about and something that needs to be talked about more is that there's actually a level of resentment that I think other BIPOC communities have against Asians as well. And I believe that this results in a lack of allyship. It results in anti-Blackness in Asian communities even, and further invisibilization and erasure for all of our communities and the issues that we're facing. And so this is something, this is a time when I'd call for better allyship and better supports. But, and one more example that I'll bring up is that, we sat for a year and watched some of us even waited scared. And I'll be very clear in saying that this was not me, because this was not Asians that looked like me, but we saw fellow Asians getting attacked on the streets for a year. And it took 8 individuals getting targeted and murdered, 6 of whom were Asian women, for anyone to really say anything or do anything. And so for folks that are listening, I'll ask for reflection after everything that we've shared. Why do you think it took so long for people to do anything after there had been countless others hurt and even murdered? And why did we have to lose those sisters to get visibility on this dangerous issue of anti-Asian violence? And so I will leave it with that. Thanks, Rowena.
Thanks, Kiana. Thanks, Sarah and Sam. We are, I have 2 minutes left for this question. Does anyone else, Tamika or Ryan, want to chime in before I go to my next question? Who gets to unmute first?
I'll let Ryan go since they're more, if they want to have something to say.
Okay. Ryan.
I think that I kind of grew up with like this invisible hand that was like playing to make me a model minority, and no one ever said like you had to do this or you had to get good grades or whatever, but I just like felt like I strived to do that. I don't know if it's because I looked up to my parents so much and their achievements, or I just inherently knew that like even parts of me were somewhat racist, not on purpose, but like I knew I didn't want to be like someone who had less. And that isn't any fault of theirs, but that is, and it's just another version of a human being. And I think that by dismantling this idea that there are models and they're minorities, that we can all just see each other as human beings.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, I'll go to our next question. So building on the previous question is the eroticization of Asian and NHPI women. How have stereotypes hurt Asian American and NHPI cis women and LGBTQ plus members of our communities? And I'm going to ask Ryan and Sam to respond to this question. So I'll start with Ryan.
Thank you, Rowena. Like I mentioned earlier, there just weren't a lot of role models that I could look up to explore my gender or my sexuality. And so I just spent a really long time feeling like I was just nothing. I just existed in the world and did my thing, but I didn't look for a partner. I didn't look at myself. It just was really hard to navigate that, and really discovering that there was another world to the gender binary, like being on the other side of that parallel was just so liberating. And with the rise of anti-Asian violence, there was a film documentary called Slaying the Dragon. And it was I think UC Berkeley documentary about media from kind of the beginning of media to the 80s. And they showed the portrayal of women, Asian women in particular, and how they have been seen as like an object, and that they had to act coy or mysterious and always had to play kind of a sexual conqueror or whatever. And like I saw that in media, and like when we think of where these stereotypes come from, it's really like media or in school. And so like school kind of talked about immigration, of like Asians came to America to work. That was one of the stereotypes, was that we're hard workers. And in the media, it was that we were this object, and it really made me see how like my aunts and family members may have been treated in their workplace. And my aunt had told me that like in the 80s that she was definitely sexually harassed for being Asian. And in that moment, like especially being in the corporate world, you can't do anything. And I think now that there's more awareness and people are standing up, and there's just more vocabulary and recognition that the people who controlled media aren't right. The people that control our corporations aren't right. Because when you look and think about who they are, they're white men. And those people that are telling these stories through media that Asian women are portrayed in one way only show a really fantasized version of women in general. And I think as a non-binary person, I can't think of very many movies where there are non-binary characters until recently. And that's because with the accessibility of technology, that more and more people are able to tell their own stories. And I think what's really awesome now are that these stereotypes are being broken, because we're seeing more voices, we're seeing more people, and people are like myself are able to identify with someone else and to be able to relate. And in this world where we have so many people and we're kind of pigeonholed to not relate to anybody except for what you see on TV. And for a long time, like I only saw white, straight, cis people. And as media kind of progressed and the LGBTQ plus movement began, the only people in that category were gay men, and they're white. And I think that comfortability for white people to see one type of the LGBTQ plus spectrum was just playing it safe. And now we have so many more movies, and another documentary called Disclosure, which dismantles the LGBTQ plus population in media as well. So if any of y'all want to look up two things, I would look up Disclosure. I believe it's on Netflix, and then Slaying the Dragon.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Sam?
Yeah, so this is a really big question, but I will try to tackle it. Like Ryan mentioned, the hypersexualization of Asian women, femmes, female-bodied people, centers the cis heteronormative white supremacist patriarchy. It enables others, and I'd say mostly white men, to fetishize and objectify Asian femmes, women, female-bodied people. Like Rand mentioned, the stereotypes of being submissive, mysterious, and exotic. These stereotypes are harmful, and then it often leads to violence. And I think that, I mean, this has always been an issue. And 21 years ago in Spokane, Washington, there were 3 Japanese women that were abducted, and 2 of them were assaulted. And the articles that I looked up, they went through horrendous trauma. And the articles that I looked up, they never mentioned the race, because you can just assume that they were white men that abducted them and traumatized them. And so I think that these stereotypes encourage that violence. And considering the Atlanta shootings, that the violence hasn't stopped 21 years later. I think that the stereotypes also bring into question desirability politics. So analyzing how these stereotypes play into fat phobia, texturism, featureism, colorism, etc. is important. And I just want to close with our gender identities and affectional orientations are so much more complex and nuanced than what cis heteronormativity has to offer and white supremacy has to offer.
Thank you, Sam. And I do have additional, like 2 additional 3 minutes if any one of the other panelists would like to comment on this question. So Sarah, Tamika, Kiana, anyone want to answer this particular question or want to add to what was shared?
Being a fiction writer, like too, and consuming a lot of like media, like that's kind of something that's always on my mind, is like the fetishization of women, because it really does largely come from a male gaze, particularly a white male gaze. Because if you really, really, really think about it, and I'm talking very generally, is that like in most indigenous cultures, there is a level of respect for the role of women. Like even in native cultures, especially in native and First Nations cultures, like women are like center of a lot of that stuff. You're, and in my culture, like my family specifically, the women in my family are very like, they essentially lead the family. The men just kind of do what the will of the women, which is a lot of times in a lot of brown cultures. In white Christian centered, and I'm Catholic, mind you, but white Christian centered cultures, that's not really a thing. That's not, it's very much about, and I've had multiple conversations with women of color of how, in a lot of white families and white cultures, women, mainly Christian, I'm talking about too, women are seen as submissive. They're supposed to like give up the financial control to their husbands, the sexual control to their husbands. And again, I'm Catholic, but this is largely comes from a very white Christian interpretation of or the Bible or whatever, whole Adam and Eve thing. And so that really plays into the fact of how women and women of color and Asian women are seen in media. It's because they are there to consume. Like a lot of the fetishization of Asian American women and women of color in general is because they're, it's almost like you think of as white people see them as, white men see them as exotic. They're almost like palatable little dessert exotic fruits to try. They're there for their consumption, which in reality is kind of how westernization and capitalization and white culture, which, well, I would say white culture is the thing because it's not, but um that kind of culture, western culture, is centered, everything else that is not theirs and not them is for consumption. It is to consume. It is for use. It is there for them. There is no lens of respect for, and I'm obviously speaking generally, but there is no lens for these people. They're human beings. There's no respect for the land being, um, they're having being respect for land. There's no respect for anything that is not essentially created, or not even created, that is not originating from the mind or the hands of a white man, more or less. And it's very harsh to say that, but it's true. If any, like, if women in here, like white women in here, think in your lives, the men probably do have control. But I'm going to stop there because I think we have to move on.
Okay. Thank you, Tamika. So our last question, well, not our last question, but before we go to the audience question, has to do with colorism. So I'm Filipino. I think I mentioned that already. And I remember growing up and always being told to stay out of the sun because I wouldn't want to get darker. So colorism is ubiquitous in our communities, but it's something we don't really talk about, let alone dissect where it came from. So furthermore, our issue with colorism manifests in anti-Blackness among our communities. What are your thoughts about this? So I have Tamika, Ryan, and Sarah, and I'll start with Tamika.
I've been itching to talk about this. So I'm going to say something, and I want everybody to listen to me for like 2 seconds. To these 2 words I'm about to say. I'm me. I am Black. I'm Black. I want you to sit with that for a second. I want you to register the feeling you got when I said I'm Black. Like, think about that for a second. And I bet you it wasn't a positive feeling. It was some kind of like dirty feeling that you're probably holding back. And in academia, you kind of know better, but in your heart of hearts, it probably was a very like you don't have a positive. Maybe it's neutral now, but you don't have a positive outlook on Black people. And then I want you to think about the fact that, I mean, I'm Filipina as well as Chamorro and Black. How many of my people had to die for me to exist? Like, how many, like, let's talk about like already Filipino and Pacifica, but how many Black people had to die for me to even exist? Like, whole countries of my people, whatever that even was, because I don't know where I come from. I don't know if I'm Nigerian or Ghanaian or Ethiopian. I don't know if I'm from Mali. I don't know. But it's kind of damning how in America, every comes up every time there's an issues too with racial issues. Everybody wonders, well, they do it for Black people. Well, I'll be honest, almost everything y'all went through, not y'all, everything that a lot of other minorities went through, we went through in America specifically first. Like, and I want to say that sans saying, First Nations people, because that's an entirely different ball game. And I'd say we're largely somewhere on the same level. But the way, and that gets complicated. We don't have time for that. But the metric of almost all other in America racial discrimination is pretty much measured by how Black are you. Like Latinx people or Latine people are like right next to us. And then there's like other brown people. And then there's like Asian Americans. And then there's like maybe Pacific Islanders somewhere near them. But like being Black is like the worst thing you can be in like almost every other minority. Pacific Islander people like that. And I'm growing up Filipino as well. I do remember that. And it's even still a joke. because we're only human beings, that, you know, you don't want to get too dark. You know, you don't want to get too dark. Why don't you want to be too dark? Because being dark is just bad. Yeah, it has to do with the fact that, you know, if you're in the sun, you were like a worker, but it also has to do with the fact that nobody wants to be mistaken as black. Like, black is dirty, realistically speaking. And in your heart of hearts, when I say that, that is exactly the feeling. Being black is dirty. It means you stink. It means, you know, and black, you know, black woman means you're like, you're pretty much only, your only thing, the thing you are worth is having sex, selling sex. You're not worth a brain, you know. And that kind of, like, for me, definitely impacted my identity. um so as a black woman, you know, growing up, my dad told me, like, as a black woman, you're gonna have to work twice as hard. I now been more or less conditioned for the fact that I don't have to just work twice. I have to be better than you. I have to be the best person in the room. I have to exceed. If I don't excel, I'm not worth the skin and the life that I even have. I'm not worth being loved, which is really what a lot of people in general go through. You know, you think that you're not worth love. And I'd say that everybody, most minorities feel like that. Probably like, if I don't excel, if I don't meet that model minority myth, I don't deserve love, because that's what white capitalism teaches you. You have to earn love. Like, so for the longest time, I didn't even consider myself indigenous. I was black first, because when you look at me, that's the first thing I am. And I'm very proud to be black. It's just also very damning to be a very specific mix of people that don't really spend a lot of time with each other necessarily. Or if they do, it's largely through the military. My parents met through, you know, because my dad was in the military. Um, and even that is complicated, because most people who go into the military, especially people of color, go because they're poor. Like, they don't go because they have patriotism. They go because you get your what's the word, you get retirement for sure if you make it. You get housing, you get all these things. And that's what we need. And to get back to the point, because I'm going on a slight tangent, yeah, being black is actually really difficult when you come from an Asian and Pacific household or people, because I'll be honest, Asian and Pacific people can be some of the most racist people you ever meet when it comes to black people, because we're dirty. That's essentially what it is. You know, and it hurts. I feel like I'm losing myself in the emotional part of this, but yeah, people don't seem to realize that being black is actually really hard no matter where you go. And even African people don't like African Americans, man. We're like, nobody really likes us, and then everybody kind of complains about why we get all the attention. I could, like, based off of community, I could fill my calendar with the shit black people go through. I don't have to go to nobody else's shit, because I could fill my 365 days with the shit that I have to go through. And you know what? We just deal with it. Why do you think that mental health is so difficult for black people? Because we don't have time for mental health. Only thing we have time for is surviving. And I'm going to end with that.
Tamika, thank you for that. I appreciate that honesty and the vulnerability, and just being straight up. So I'm going to go to Ryan and then Sarah.
When Tamika, you said you're black, I definitely just had a neutral response. I don't think at any point I ever would have had a negative response. And maybe I'm so nervous to be here. I'm like, I want to have a positive response, but I just need to concentrate. But I feel like I've had a different experience than you, obviously. I mean, I'm not black. I grew up at the beach. People almost strive to be tan, whether they were Asian or white. Like, so my white friends are darker than I am, and I never thought that it was because they wanted to be black. I just thought it was because they wanted goofy tan lines. Like, I even did that once. I got super dark before my junior high school picture because I was like, I don't know what I wanted to look like. I just was like, how dark can I be? Like, that was just a test that I had. But I mean, I wasn't allowed to go out in the sun because my mom was a pharmacist and was like all like a health freak. I was like, don't get skin cancer. That's the reason why I couldn't go out in the sun. But I definitely do recognize the anti-Blackness when it comes to skin color. When I think about my grandparents, they lived or my grandma still lives in Carson, and it's a predominantly Black community. And I don't remember exactly what they would say, but I would go to their house when I was a kid after like preschool or kindergarten, and they'd be saying, and I don't remember the word, but they'd say in Chinese, there's Black people outside, and they're talking about their neighbors. And I'm like, why don't you just know your neighbors? You've been living here for like 40, 50 years. And it's because they came from Hong Kong, and whether it was to leave financial instability or even like stricter government or whatever it was, they came to America to have this sense of freedom. And when they got here, white people told them, hey, as long as you help us oppress Black people, we'll give you a job. We'll give you a place to be as long as you're not Black. And because they were trying to make it in this world, they're like, okay, yeah. And it wasn't actually their fault. It was because the people that had held the power were telling them, this is how you have to be if you want to be in America. And I just knew that was wrong. And like, I wasn't allowed to go and talk and hang out with the kids outside. But I mean, growing up, my teammates were Black, my teammates were Latinx, my teammates were Asian, my teammates were white. I don't feel like I had this feeling that I couldn't be friends or have a relationship with people because they were Black. And it wasn't like I didn't see skin color, because that's not what we want to do. We don't want to say, I don't see color, because that's invalidating everyone's existence and heritage and culture and who they are. Like, we want to see their color, but we want to make sure that we are treating people with the respect and dignity that their color and their heritage and who they are is. Is that how I end that sentence?
Great. Sorry. And Ryan, I've been given the 2-minute warning, so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to wrap up this question.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, so this question brings up a few different things for me. For the Indian community, we were colonized by the British, and like many other countries were. And this idea of being fairer in complexion is just another way white supremacy is rampant at a global scale. It is also connected to the caste system, where your complexion is considered an indicator of those who would work outside of manual labor in the sun versus those who are inside, so a higher caste. Growing up, it was always something we were yelled at about before going to the beach or running around outside with cousins. There was always a comment about staying out of the sun so we didn't get darker. And it's still something the elders in my family will comment on whenever they see me. It's like almost the very first thing that they say. So colorism has resulted in a huge industry for lightening products in India. And I actually did a quick Google search about it because I was curious about how rampant the issue is. And the World Health Organization says that about half of all skincare products in India are lighteners designed to brighten, which means whiten, user skin color, which roughly translates to about $500 million industry in India. And the most popular one is called Fair and Lovely, which is problematic in and of itself. And it's something you see in grocery stores. I've seen it in homes. So it's a current issue. And there's been an ongoing activism and attention around addressing this issue of colorism and lightening products within the Indian community. And actually the BLM movement and modern ideas of racial equality have been a big part in this movement to kind of get rid of that kind of stuff, which is really great. Something else that comes up for me, though, is colorism within the broader community of Asian Americans in general. So with the spotlight now being put on our communities with public instances of violence and racism, there have been more articles and Instagram accounts talking about the experiences of Asian Americans within the US. And I always find myself really excited to find more resources on what it means to be an Indian American. And I'm often disappointed with how regularly South Asians are left out of the narratives and the resources. Even with the conversation about anti-Asian violence, when people finally took notice after the Atlanta shooting, there wasn't that same kind of outcry after 4 Sikh community members were killed in Indianapolis, not even a month later. And that definitely hurts, you know? And it feels like being the brown Asians, we don't fit into the archetype of what being Asian is. So I think that has a lot to say about continuing conversations and issues about colorism within our broader coalition.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. Okay, we're going to audience question. So here's one of them. Hopefully I'm reading this correctly. Identity is something that can both individuate and bring people together. As you consider the dynamic boundaries of the various identities you claim, how do you see them defining a unique experience? How do you see them bringing yourself in community with others? Anybody want to take a stab at this one?
I wouldn't mind. Oh, Ryan, you can go ahead and knock yourself out.
Ryan, okay.
Okay, I really like this question because it does talk about how we are unique because we hold all these identities, and it doesn't stop at our skin color or our name or like what we look like. It's like, I mean, I work in an architecture firm. I founded an organization that I'm also trying to bring people together on a common ground that we are reimagining Spokane. I also like to rock climb. I like to ride bikes. I like to play sports. I like to do all of these things. And I get to be myself in these different spheres. And so I think that is what I've been lucky to be able to hold myself in a space and be safe in those spaces where I can continue those activities. There's definitely been spaces that I've left and kind of tolerated because I couldn't be myself, and it just was a different place, and like the people there didn't have as wide of an experience, and like I just sometimes feel like I hope that when I go into a space that they see something else and they're like, oh, that's another person. They can be anything they want, just like I could be anything I want. And this question kind of goes into like why our world is so cool is because we aren't just a monolith, and that we aren't just what the media portrays us as, is coy, mysterious, exotic people. Like, look at me, I'm not any of that stuff. I don't want to be that stuff. So I think it's great that people, especially like I'm feeling like I can define myself more in the ways that I want and take ownership to myself.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Lisa, I'm not seeing this one question, but there was a question about resources on Asian American. Is that the one you were referring to, Kiana? I cannot remember.
Question, should we change the makeup organizations that are AAPI?
Oh, yes, that one. Okay. It's like, should we? Yes. Do you remember that? Or Lisa, do you remember what the question was about? Should we change? Is it the naming of AAPI organizations?
Yes. So the question is, should we change the make of organizations that are AAPI? And I wasn't sure if it was the names of the organizations or the makeup of the organizations. So either way.
Okay. Kiana, you want to go respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. And when I hear make, I just think of like organization in general. But my answer to this question would be, I think that organizations that are multiracial, multicultural, serving both Asians and Pacific Islanders at this moment in time, that's their mission. I think that they need to look at their funding, their data for who they're serving, their board makeup, their staff makeup, and see where the resources and where the representation actually is. And I think for some AAPI serving organizations that they would find that they're not serving PIs at all. And then I think for some, there might be some representation, there might be some funding that goes towards efforts in NHPI communities, but they might not be authentic or fully led by community members, by NHPI community members. And so I I would just ask organizations to examine themselves. And if they are truly an Asian or Asian American serving organization, then maybe, yes, change. And if they are truly a multicultural, multiracial organization, then make sure that you're equitably serving the organization or the communities that you say you are.
Thank you. So I have a question. One of our other questions is, what are good mental health coping strategies?
I would love to answer that.
Okay, Tamika.
I would love
Got
to answer
that.
that. Because I've been in therapy basically for 2 years. Like, and every time I stop, there's always something new that I like dig out from the layers of underneath, my emotional ecosystem that I'd like to name. Um, I cannot stress this enough, but you people need therapy. And therapy is like, I know it's like, well, everybody should go to therapy. No, everybody should go to at least a little bit of therapy, because I can guarantee you've got issues it's about the mid-20s that you really start like digging into those, because that's when your brain is really like, oh, hey, we're mature now, we're supposed to be cool now. But therapy is the number one thing I would say, and find you a good therapist that you trust, that you have some kind of relationship with. But I'm sorry, my house is loud. But if not, if you can't afford therapy, you can't go to therapy, that's understandable. You know, it is important to examine self-worth, like as a, however you feel that makes you feel better, to dig into that. Because like self-worth is a large reason why most people just have issues. Like most people's issues is, I want love, but I don't think I deserve it for XYZ reason. And knowing that, like for instance, if you're a person of faith, it's not a terrible idea to go to like a priest or a pastor or whatever. That's what they're there for. Or if you're outside of like Christianity, whatever person is there, that's their position to help you. If you're not a person of faith, then, like I said, a therapist, but there also are like online talk spaces and text places. It is really important that you talk about your stuff, because I'm going to guarantee you, most people don't want to talk about their stuff. Most people do not want to speak about their issues, because most people don't want to look at their issues in the mirror. There's like certain zones in your head that's probably really off limits. You have to deal with that. I spend a lot of time convincing people to get help, because a lot of the time they just don't want to because they're scared. But the only time you can be brave is when you're scared, and you have to do it. Like, the reason why you have issues is because you don't want to deal with it. Like, you have to deal with it. And it's hard, but you have to be consistent. So I'd say whatever way that really helps you, be consistent. But I would seriously put therapy of some kind, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in an office therapist. It can be, there are other ways of doing it. There are online, text, actual office, faith-based people. Find some kind of person that is there to be almost your therapist. And the reason why too, I'd say another person, is because they're going to see and say things to you that you're not going to see and say to yourself. So that's my take.
Thank you, Tamika. Okay, next question. In the context of education, Asian Americans and NHPI are believed to be high-performing, well-adjusted students who seldom encounter discrimination or require institutional resources to be successful. They have been forced to dance a fine line between their minoritized status and the stereotype of model minority. They feel isolation and lack of representation on campus. What are your suggestions for raising the awareness about their diverse needs at the institutional level? Did you hear all that? Do you want me to read it again? It's a long one. Okay. Who wants to answer this? Sam.
Yeah,
Sam
sorry.
unmuted. Yay.
Yeah, I typed it in already, but I just wanted to quickly say that institutions aren't interested in raising awareness about students' diverse needs. Institutions are built on white supremacy. However, I think that continuing to dismantle white supremacy within yourself and spread that within your community and stay angry about it and however you feel is going to be helpful towards raising that awareness in whatever capacity you should do. But I don't think that there's any right one way to do it.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Anyone else want to add to that?
I'll add to
Tamika?
that. Sorry, I gotta soak in this question because it was a long one. But I also feel like, because on campus, like there definitely is like no like PI representation in any sort of way on EW campus, and I brought it up to some higher ends with some dancing around. Um, and I agree with Sam. There's not an interest in awareness. How about, I don't know how to say this, and I'm not talking about EW specifically, but most campus are going to go where the money is, because in the end of the day, money talks. It brought me to, I remember something where I was talking to Dave Brown Eagle, who was on the Spokane Tribe Council, and we had a very long, very, very long conversation. But something I gleaned from that too is that, you know, how lines and how things change based off of who has the money. And it's kind of the same way with for campus. A campus is going to go where the money is. So I would say that, yeah, I agree with Sam. They're not really interested in raising awareness. You kind of have to raise your own awareness. You got to make a ruckus because they're not really going to listen. Like, um, you got to be loud and just not be afraid to say something. And that's easy for me to say, to not be afraid, but you got to do it enough times for you to start. And as the older you get, you know, you stop, pardon my French, but you stop giving as much of a fuck, because now you have bills to pay. And, you know, but you got to raise your own awareness. You have to be and I do mean you, like you have to be the person that steps out somehow, whatever way you know how to contribute. I'm not necessarily going to every protest on the block, but I am writing a novel. I'm doing kind of something I love, but I'm trying to add, you know, my sense of activism to it. So whatever way that helps you be happy too, you got to add your own activism to the world.
Great. Thank you. And this is kind of a related question. So so this audience member, Judy. Hi, Judy. Thank you all for being so direct and vulnerable. If EWU could do one thing to better support Asian, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students, what would it be?
I will just start with a short answer, and I'll give a +1 to Sam because I thought that what they said was great. And I think that leaders and institutions and people working within institutions really do need to stop being complicit and need to address the white supremacy that does exist. I think that people want to, you know, offer, there is something to be said about offering services or, you know, culturally responsive ways for people to feel more like more supported. But at the end of the day, the things that are going to be hurting these students really do come down from white supremacy. So I really do want to lift up what Sam said. And there's, in every single role, no matter what role you are in, whether it's in your family, whether it's in your department, whether it's in, you know, your classroom, raise these points up and do not be complicit and do not be silent and be an ally.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I'll add to that super quickly. But this is gonna sound so low-key shallow, but put your money where your mouth is. I've had conversations with some higher up people, and I know funding with campus is complicated. I know you guys don't exactly campus don't exactly decide where the money goes, but the money's got to go to those places that don't have anything, you know, and not to a stadium, that a new freaking stadium. Like, I don't know how to say this, but got to put the money where the mouth is, because at the end of the day, we still live in a capitalist society. We still gotta live with that. Put your money where your mouth is. Like, I need to see some results. Like, for instance, land acknowledgement is great, but it doesn't mean shit if nothing is done about it. If we don't take the next step after land acknowledgement. Okay, you know, we're here, we've been here, what are you going to do about it? Like, we need some classes, we need teachers, we need programs, we need there to be opportunities for us to rise up in the ranks. you know, of some kind. So you gotta, like, camps, institutions gotta put the money where it's needed, and it can't always be going to the same people. Like, I do not give a rat's ass if the stadium gets a new, if we get a new stadium, you do the same thing on it, you run. I need some people to know where my people come from so that maybe we can stop dying. So it'd be nice if, you know, we can put some funds where places so that we can change the world a little bit, so, you know, my people could stop being murdered on the street every day. That would be my stuff.
Whoa, Tamika, good timing. I just got the time.
I got you.
Text. So great. So in closing, I want to give each of you some time to share what you love about your culture and heritages. And I'm going to start with Sarah.
Thanks, Rowena. Yeah, so there is so much that I love about my culture and heritage. I love our food and our clothes and our Bollywood movies and our super dramatic TV shows. And I'm sure many of you do too. So I actually want to take this time to name and acknowledge the COVID crisis happening in India right now, and ask you to help in whatever way you can. So if you live in Spokane or in the area, tomorrow night at Feast World Kitchen, Inland Curry is serving Indian food from 3 to 7 p.m. or until they run out, with 80% of all of the profits going to Kanna Chaye, a nonprofit organization in Mumbai trying to combat hunger in response to the COVID lockdown. They're also leading a Show Up for India raffle, where every $5 donation made for COVID relief in India is a ticket to win the local small business raffle prize, which has a bunch of goodies from different businesses in town. If you cannot do that, you can also check out giveindia.org. So that's what I'll say for mine.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Sam.
Yeah, there are lots of things that I like about Korean culture, that I love about Korean culture, and I'm also still working through the internalized oppression there. There's also a lot of things that I'm still grappling with. I love our language. I love Korean language. I love Korean food, but most of all, I love our silliness. Like, not like, it's the silliness. You can see that in the K-dramas. They're so ridiculous, and like it just speaks to my heart. That's the way my family is. That's the way we've always been. And yeah, that's what I love.
Thank you. Ryan.
Let's see. The favorite thing about my Chinese culture and heritage is that I get to think about my family. My grandma and grandpa Louie were second or third generation below the immigrants that of their ancestors. I don't know how to explain that, but their grandma and grandpa came from China to San Francisco. They grew up in San Francisco. They established roots kind of in Chinatown. My dad's grandpa owned a grocery store in Chinatown that at my last family reunion, we got to do a walking tour and we saw the grocery store, but it didn't sell groceries, it sold souvenirs. He also owned a kitchen shop that is now still a kitchen shop. And the owner that was working there told us this really rad story about how our family helped her family move from Texas to the Bay Area to have a better life there. And we walked by my grandma's dental office in Chinatown, and I just really got to see the places, even though it's like one of the largest tourist destination spots. Chinatown did start as an immigrant neighborhood born out of racism against Chinese Americans. I also, when thinking about my mom's parents, who my grandma I call Popo and grandpa are Gung Gung, I just really cherish my relationship with them and how close I got to be. And when I was growing up with them, my grandpa Gung Gung played almost every Chinese string instrument ever made. And he, unfortunately, I never got to hear him play. But every time I go to their house, my popo, who's my only living grandparent, is still there. And I feel like I get to experience my culture when I go there. Like, she still has handwritten notes in Chinese. She has Chinese soap operas on. And when I'm visiting, we get to go out to dim sum. I think I also like about my culture that I get to dissect how I've been kind of pushed away from it, and like realizing how the world has been working. And I mean, I want to get back to it, but like, I know more Spanish than Chinese, and my favorite food is pizza, and my version of soap operas are the Kardashians. Just kidding, I don't watch the Kardashians. But I feel like at the end of the day, like, I'm as far removed from Chinese culture as I am. It's still in my name, in my DNA, and in my stories.
Thank you, Ryan. Tamika.
Being more or less tri/multiracial, there's a lot of places to pull from. From my indigenous cultures, from being Filipina and Chamorro, which tend to go hand in hand oftentimes. I love the sense of community, and that's probably the one thing I've really struggled to understand here in the States, of why they're just, sense of community is just not valued. But I love that about us. And in my specific family, I love the fact that my women in my family, every year every time there's like a bunch of, because now that we all live a lot around the same area, we all live more or less in area heights. My aunts and my mom and the women with children, and live in their own place, they will basically gather around the table, calendars and everything, and they like a war meeting, and they will like dot out who's going to bring what to the family gatherings that's coming up for these specific events, which the last half of the year gets very busy with kids and everything. And it's like a war meeting, like American generals would be proud. That's how organized this is, calendars and everything. And I love that. Being Black, I love and hate, but I love that everything cool kind of comes from us in the pop media, really. All the dances, all that stuff. America would just not be as cool without us, as much as we did not ask to be here. I love the music we have, and I love Black sense of humor. Our sense of humor is pretty wicked, and I that's just my sense of humor. So there's like nobody funnier than Black people in general. And then being Filipina, I love that we're kind of like in that space of like everything that you're both kind of Pacific Islander and you're Asian, even though you're Asian, and that shouldn't, but there's so many shared spaces there. And I learned recently that my grandfather, the reason why he even met my grandmother was because he was supposed to go buy salt, and instead of going to buy salt, he hopped on a boat, and that's that story. So there's a lot. I come from a lot of like rich places, and it all makes me, and so that's something I need to learn too as I move up in the years.
Good. Thank you, Tamika. Kiana.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I always love this question and hearing everybody's answers. The couple of things I'd lift up, I do love the sense of community within my culture, and something that I think, something that I will share today that has been very front and center this last year during this pandemic has been the fact that in my culture and in my communities, we do value our elders as sacred treasures. And we do not throw them away. And every single one of their lives matters. And we are absolutely 100% only here because of them. We are woven with them. We have our traditions and our culture because of them. And I think something sad that we have seen this last year during this pandemic is these larger, and I'll say communities, but these larger populations of people in this country and in other countries too, but especially this country, what we have seen is a value over individualism and the want and need to have this liberty that has killed hundreds and thousands of our elders and people's elders. And so something that I'm proud of and something that I keep very close to my heart is the fact that our elders are our sacred treasures. And I'm so proud that we take care of them like we do, and that we value them like we do. And this has been very front and center for me. And in my last 30 seconds, I'll also just raise up the fundraiser that Sarah put out with World Feast Kitchen. They're absolutely fantastic and tasty. So go and, donate to a good cause and get some good food.
Great. Thank you, Kiana. And thank you, everyone. As a Filipino, one of the things I love about my culture, well, there's the food. Okay, kind of. There's that. There's always the food. The sense of humor, always, and laughter. And of course, when I'm with my siblings, we can get really loud, but you know how that can be when you're with siblings and getting loud. And just that, the hospitality of people. And so with that, I want to thank you all for being in part of this conversation today. And I hope that we can, and thank you for answering, those hard questions and bringing to the surface issues that we as a community really need to tackle. And so I just appreciate you all for your thoughtfulness, your honesty. And I have to say that I'm always so impressed, maybe not the right, well, impressed, as someone who is on the older side, to be surrounded with such bright and that I'm glad to have younger people who are going to be leaders, who are already leaders in our community, and proud to be part of that community and proud of your leadership in that community. So with that, thank you. And thank you to our audience for being here. And I'm like 3 minutes early. So if you still want to hang out, we can do that. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.